said nothing. Cheryl was enraged by Samuel's words to the point that she saw red. She had never imagined that someone would appear halfway through their argument and embarrass her like this. Although Natalie had put down the knife, she was still holding Cheryl's hand tightly, not wanting to leave her so easily. However, Cheryl was adamant. She did not want to admit defeat and allow the other patrons to say whatever they wanted. She would not apologize. But Nick could not bear to stand there and face the criticism of so many people. When he looked at Natalie, there was a hint of complaint in his eyes. But in the end, he had no choice but to lower his head and apologize. Liam, we're sorry. We shouldn't have said that to you. Hey, what are you doing? Why should we apologize to them? Cheryl's expression immediately changed when she heard Nick apologize. Having him apologize to the boy was much more embarrassing than apologizing herself. Now that Nick had apologized to Liam, Natalie knew she couldn't do anything else. She had intended to leave Cheryl, but when she heard Cheryl's question, her eyes squinted dangerously, and she said in a warning tone, Nick, you heard her. I wanted to let her go, but it seems she doesn't want to leave. This doesn't concern you. She looked hatefully at Cheryl and said very clearly, you will apologize to Liam, or no one here will be able to save you. Cheryl felt the pain in her hands and let out a groan. She saw the police preparing to leave and felt very resentful. Natalie was determined, and Cheryl knew that Nick and the police would not help her. She had no choice but to reluctantly admit defeat. She glared at Liam and finally said, I'm sorry. What are you sorry for? Say it clearly. Natalie would not accept the apology if it didn't sound sincere. Cheryl was so furious that one could see the steam coming out of her ears. But since she had already said she was sorry, she took a deep breath to calm herself down and said, Sorry, Liam. I didn't mean what I said. Liam was shocked by his mother's bravery. He idolized her. Natalie gave Cheryl a glance, satisfied at last that she had apologized properly. Liam didn't feel hurt anymore, and Natalie was no longer angry. She released Cheryl. In the future, when you see me, walk the opposite way. Natalie warned her with an icy glare. I won't let you off so easily next time. Cheryl wanted to retaliate, but Nick pulled her away. She left dejectedly, but before she did, she gave Natalie an angry look. The fiasco was finally over. Cheryl and Nick left the restaurant. Everyone returned to their seats and ignored Natalie. Before the police left, they said their goodbyes to Samuel. Only then did Natalie remember the man who had helped her. She looked around for him, but he was nowhere to be found. She searched the restaurant and finally found him in the VIP room. Although she wasn't sure why he had helped her, she thought it would be rude not to thank him directly. So she took Liam and walked into the room. Sir, I wanted to thank you for helping me earlier. Just as she finished speaking, she looked up and saw Bryce sitting in the room. Why is it always him? Him. Natalie froze on the spot when she saw Bryce. She was unable to react. The words she wanted to say were stuck in her throat. Running through her mind was the last conversation she had had with him a few days ago, when she had told him she was leaving the country. Without realizing what she was doing, she pulled Liam close to her and took a couple of steps back. What if he thought she had been lying? He wouldn't let her off easy, right? Liam's eyes lit up when he saw Bryce, and he quickly rushed over to him. He hugged his leg excitedly and said, Dad, there you are. I missed you so much. Samuel, who was sitting next to Bryce, was speechless when he heard what the little boy said. He looked like a good boy, but Samuel wasn't sure if he was joking or not. He had just called someone his dad, and that someone was Bryce. Everyone knew that Bryce was a cold-hearted man. Once someone had angered him, even if they were a child, they would not be spared. Samuel quickly went over to Liam and said to him, Little boy, you have the wrong person. This man isn't your dad. You can't go around calling him that so casually, all right? He was about to squat down to Liam's level, but the boy ignored him and stared at Bryce. His expression was very pitiful. Samuel was a bit embarrassed to be ignored by the boy. He said to Bryce, Bro, don't get angry. Kids say the darndest things. As he said this, he quietly gestured to Natalie to take her child away. Seeing that Bryce wasn't angry yet, he felt a bit relieved. It would be unthinkable if he got angry, because there would be nothing he could do. Natalie understood what Samuel's gestures meant, but she was slow to react, because she still hadn't recovered from the shock of seeing Bryce. She had said she was leaving the country, and now she felt as if he had caught her red-handed. Wasn't this similar to digging your own grave? But there was nothing to be done now. Hopefully, he wouldn't think she was lying to him. She glanced at Bryce, just as he looked at her as well. There was an unknown light shining in his eyes. She felt her scalp tingle as soon as their eyes met. That was it. She was a goner. She had known he would be angry if he saw her again. She didn't know why she cared whether he was angry or not. She quickly went up to Liam and pulled him away, but Bryce was quicker and picked the boy up and sat him on his lap. Natalie and Samuel both looked at him in surprise. Bryce ignored them and asked Liam, "Did you have enough to eat?" Liam shook his head, indicating that he was still hungry. After all, who would be in the mood to eat when horrible people like that came into the restaurant? Bryce immediately put his food down in front of Liam. He said, "Then eat some more. Don't let yourself get hungry." Liam was ecstatic. He had never eaten with his father before, and he was excited. Just as he was about to tuck in, he said to his stunned mother, "Mom, come and eat. Don't let yourself get hungry." Natalie felt helpless. She knew it would be rude to refuse, so she could only bite the bullet and sit down next to Bryce. For a long while, she didn't touch her fork. Samuel, who was still standing, finally came to his senses. He looked at Bryce in surprise and asked, "What just happened?" Bryce was holding Liam on his lap. He looked coldly at Samuel and kept quiet. Bryce had not denied that Liam was his son, and this left Samuel in total shock. Not only that, but he was hugging the boy as well. Could he really be? Could he be this boy's father? Samuel was on the verge of exploding, but he didn't dare ask Bryce about it, so he sat quietly and secretly observed their interactions. Natalie sat at the table and kept her head down. Bryce stared at her coldly, which made her very uncomfortable. She didn't know what to say. What she really wanted now was to take Liam and run away. If this continued, she thought she would faint. But Liam did not feel the tension between the two of them. He rolled his eyes and said cheekily, "Daddy, I missed you. Mommy has been bullied by bad people. I am not strong enough, and I couldn't protect her." He felt really sad, and he suddenly burst into tears as he thought of his mom being bullied. Bryce's heart softened. He was very concerned for Liam, so he said, "Tell me what happened." Liam gradually stopped crying. "It's all because of my nasty auntie. She didn't let Mommy leave when we were at the airport. And when Mommy was looking for a job, they didn't let anybody hire her. And today, they were mean to her. They caused a lot of trouble." Bryce frowned. When he'd overheard the argument, he'd guessed why Natalie hadn't left the country, but now it was confirmed. He hadn't known so many things were happening behind the scenes. No wonder this woman had applied for a job at the lousy Star Entertainment. Now the doubt in Bryce's heart was resolved. Although he did not respond to what Liam had said, the anger he felt in his heart disappeared. His attitude toward Natalie changed. He realized that she must have been too busy arguing to eat before, so he said, "You have something to eat too." Natalie waved her hands and said, "It's all right, I'm full." He must be joking. She had already troubled him enough. How could she bother him any longer, let alone eat with him? Bryce didn't pay any attention to her. Instead, he raised his hand to get the waiter's attention and ordered the dishes Natalie had been eating before. The waiter took the order and left. What had just happened? Samuel was extremely shocked. It seemed they all knew each other. What sort of relationship did they have? And Bryce himself had ordered food for this woman. This was too far-fetched. He had been holding in his curiosity ever since Natalie came into the room, and he couldn't stand it anymore. "Bro, is this your wife? Shouldn't you introduce us?" Natalie was embarrassed and blushed. Before Bryce could reply, she said, "Sir, you've misunderstood. I'm not Bryce's wife. My name is Natalie, and this is my son Liam. I came in here to thank you for helping me just now." "My name is Samuel Hammond, and forget it. There's no need to worry about it." Samuel was very polite to Natalie, but he kept looking at Bryce, waiting for him to respond. Sensing Samuel's burning gaze, Bryce glanced at him, raised his eyebrows, and said,
Oh my gosh.
"You've been talking non-stop since you got here. Is the food not to your liking? Shut up and eat, yeah?" Samuel choked on hearing that. This restaurant was part of Bryce's subsidiary company. Who would dare say the food here was not to their liking? He could only bite his tongue. The atmosphere was suddenly slightly awkward. Fortunately, the food for Natalie arrived not long after.
Pahiram ng charger. Nakalip ako sa white. My goodness. Asan na yun? Hello sa aking 1 million viewer.
She had no choice but to lower her head and focus on her meal. With Liam after a short while. But when Natalie had finished her meal, Liam was reluctant to leave. Seeing that his mother was going to leave with him, he held Bryce's hand and shouted, "Daddy, I want to be with you! Daddy, don't go!" This trick of Liam's often worked, and this occasion was no exception. Bryce hesitated, and Liam, sensing this, quickly continued, "Don't go, okay? We need Daddy. Daddy will protect us. Mommy and I won't be bullied by bad people." Natalie wished the earth would open up and swallow her. She was speechless and didn't know where Liam had learned to say these kinds of things. Embarrassed, she was about to explain, but Bryce frowned and asked her, "Where do you live now? We'll get you home." Natalie hesitated for a moment, but realized it was very rare for Liam to be so reliant on someone. With that in mind, she followed her heart and told Bryce their address. Liam was very excited during the drive home. He couldn't sit still. He was so curious about everything, pointing here and there while Bryce held him. Natalie, though, stared out of the car window in a daze. Samuel was driving, but he looked in the rearview mirror. He caught Bryce's gaze, intentionally or unintentionally, then glanced at Natalie's profile. He was even more bewildered seeing their reactions. It seemed they did not have a close relationship, but maybe it wasn't that simple. The car soon arrived at Natalie's place. Natalie heaved a sigh of relief and said, "Thank you for today. We'll head in now."
Walay.
Natalie thought to carry Liam out of the car, but instead, Liam looked at Bryce, wide-eyed, and asked, "Daddy, aren't you coming in with us?" Natalie didn't know what had got into Liam today, constantly pestering Bryce and calling him Daddy. If it had only happened once or twice, she could have forgiven Liam for not being sensible. But now she felt that he was going overboard. She was losing her patience. She scolded Liam softly. "Liam, stop being naughty. Come with Mommy now." Seeing his mom getting angry, Liam let go of Bryce's hand and nodded his head sadly, saying, "I'm sorry, Mommy. I didn't mean to make you angry. I just missed Daddy." Liam's eyes were getting red and tears started to fall. He felt unfairly scolded by his mom. Bryce had no intention of going into the building with them, but seeing Liam like this made his heart ache again. He hesitated, but did not move. Samuel noticed the little boy's face, and his heart started to melt. Bryce, Bryce, how about you take the little guy? I'll wait for you here. He gave Bryce a wink as he spoke, ensuring Bryce understood his meaning. Bryce glared at Samuel, thinking that he really was very annoying. He rubbed the tip of his nose and laughed nervously. Knowing Bryce had a bad temper, he didn't want to provoke him. Natalie said, "We've troubled you enough already. It's fine, really. There's no need. Liam, say goodbye to both uncles. Let's go." It was difficult for Liam not to show his disappointment, but he obeyed his mom and said farewell to Bryce and Samuel. Just as Liam was about to get out of the car, he asked Bryce, "Dad, will you come and visit us?" Bryce looked perplexed, but seeing Liam's hopeful look, he nodded. Liam smiled broadly and said, "Yes," pumping his fist before joining his mom. Bryce stared at Natalie and Liam through the car window as they walked away, his gaze never leaving them. Samuel, looking at Bryce in the rearview mirror, realized Bryce was not the child's father. He assumed the little boy must be mistaken about Bryce being his dad. However, Bryce's handling the situation surprised Samuel. It was obvious that Bryce didn't despise the child. This was miracle enough in itself. Samuel knew there was no point in questioning Bryce about this, as he would not give him a straight answer. So he asked casually, "Bryce, are you going home now?" Bryce looked at him coldly and said, "Yes, let's go." Samuel nodded before starting the car and driving away. Natalie stopped outside the building entrance. She'd sensed Bryce's gaze on her all the way up to the walk, and she felt confused. When they got indoors, she planned on telling Liam not to call Bryce Dad anymore. The poor kid was missing a father's love, and Natalie felt sorry for him. But at the same time, she couldn't continue to let him call Bryce Daddy when Bryce wasn't really his father. As Natalie walked up the stairs, she saw a familiar figure at the entrance to the corridor. When she saw the man, her face turned cold and she said, "What are you doing here? You're not welcome here. Go away." Liam also saw the man and subconsciously moved in front of his mom to protect her, shouting, "You're a bad person, and you're not allowed to bully my mom." Natalie was worried that Liam would get hurt, so she pulled him behind her to shield him. She looked cautiously at the man. It was the man she'd had the standoff with this evening and didn't want to see, Nick Barnard. It would have been very easy, she thought, for the Barnard family to find out where she was living if they wanted to. She was furious at that realization. Nick probably came here when he left the restaurant, waiting for her to return. He hadn't even changed his clothes. Nick looked at Liam, starting to feel restless. Nick thought about how, if the accident hadn't happened, and it would be him standing beside Natalie instead of this little boy. Thinking about this, Nick's expression soured. He glared at her. "Natalie, we've known each other for over a decade, and you know how I treated you. Because of our past, I didn't want to hurt you." Natalie interrupted him coldly. "Stop it. I don't want to talk about the past, so there's no need to say anything." But as soon as she said that, her heart, if Nick had believed in her at the beginning, would they really have ended up like this? Anger was written all over Nick's face. He said, "Natalie, you betrayed me back then and I let it go. All these years, the person who has been there to support and accompany me is Cheryl. So if you even think about hurting her, don't blame me for getting mad. So you came all the way over here today to give me a warning?" There was ridicule in Natalie's eyes as she smirked coldly. Nick saw that smirk and realized that she was no longer the same person she had been. The Natalie he had known back then was never this cold and hard. Suddenly, he felt his heart ache. Nick took a deep breath and closed his eyes helplessly. He could only comfort himself by reminding himself that this was the woman who had betrayed him. She was no longer the Natalie he used to know. "Natalie," he went on, "all Cheryl does is speak well of you. Don't you realize that it was because of her that your father permitted you to return? When you slept with someone else and betrayed me, it was Cheryl that tried to cover up for you. It was so painful. I couldn't bear it. If Cheryl hadn't been there for me, I don't know what I would have done." Natalie felt even more bitter. Everything that had happened, it seemed, had been manipulated by Cheryl. And now the tables were turned, and suddenly it was her fault? She really had to applaud Cheryl's skillful scheming. Perhaps a fool like Nick would actually believe Cheryl. Natalie couldn't help but feel a little sorry for him. She said, "Are you done talking? If so, please leave. You're not welcome here."
Ha?
Natalie thought, "There's nothing left to explain." And anyway, since it happened a long time ago, and it was now far in the past, there was no point explaining it. She moved to go past Nick, taking out her keys to open the door. But Nick was angered by Natalie's attitude. He blocked her way and said condescendingly, "Natalie, after all those years you spent abroad, I thought you changed. But no, you're still the same selfish person that thinks only about herself. Why was I even with you back then? I was really blind." This last remark riled Natalie. He was really pushing their already delicate relationship to a point where they would be worse than strangers. Losing her patience, Natalie snorted. "I see that you haven't changed either after all these years. You're still a brainwashed fool. Now get lost. I don't even want to look at you." She quickly pushed Liam in front of her and approached the door. Nick banged his fist on the door in anger, refusing to let Natalie go in. "Natalie, you were the one that did the shameful thing. You let me down, and now you're acting like you were wrongly accused? You really are despicable." Nick saw her expression change, and he felt better after giving vent to what he kept locked inside him all these years. He said, "You're lucky. Cheryl still thinks about you, and was able to find someone to be with you. Otherwise, who would want with a kid like that?" Furious, Natalie shouted, "You ass! Get the hell out of here!" She pushed Nick away from the door, opened it, and went inside with Liam, slamming the door shut behind her. She was afraid that if Nick didn't leave, she wouldn't be able to keep her composure and would break down. After all was said and done, he was still a man whom she had loved deeply long back. But Nick was still outside the door, refusing to move. He called out, "Natalie, let me give you a word of advice, yeah? You should accept the arrangement. Otherwise, when the time comes, the Davidsons will use any means they have to force you to accept it. I'd like to see how much better off you'd be." "Get lost!" Natalie shouted through the door. After a long while, Nick left, and it was finally quiet outside. Natalie was able to relax at last and leaned against the door, her face sad. Nick had completely ruined her good mood. She knew now that the Davidsons wouldn't let go of this arrangement. She had to think of a way around it. She couldn't let them get hold of Liam again and use him to threaten her.
Wag tong ano. Ayoko
Liam,
na
watching
tong
from
may
the shadows,
kiss.
could see how worried she was. He blurted out, "Mommy, Daddy is really amazing. Why don't you let him protect us? Let Daddy protect us." An image of Bryce's arrogant face appeared in her mind. It was true that Bryce could protect them. But why would such a capable and powerful man want to be with a single mom with a child? Natalie pulled Liam over and hugged him. Patiently, she said, "Liam, don't talk such nonsense. That person is not your dad, so we can't bother him anymore or annoy him." Liam nodded reluctantly. He looked at his mom with wide eyes, wanting to speak, but kept his thoughts to himself. But Natalie only saw Liam nod. Unaware of what he was really thinking, she felt relieved. "Come on," she said, "let's get cleaned up," and headed for the bathroom. Liam finished his shower quickly and went to his bedroom. Natalie was very tired after the stressful day, so she decided to have a nap herself after she finished taking her shower. Liam lay on his bed but couldn't fall asleep. He kept thinking about the incident this evening when Nick had come to cause trouble at their home. Feeling and desperate with fear, he decided that there was no option but to use his mom's phone to secretly call Bryce. Bryce had arrived home earlier after Samuel dropped him off. As soon as Bryce stepped through the door, he heard his parents talking about him in the living room. His mother was talking as he walked into the living room. Bryce's marriage is top priority. "Oh, Bryce, you're back. Your father and I were just talking about how your grandparents have found a few delightful women for you to meet this weekend. We hope you can take the time to meet them." Bryce, taking off his jacket, paused. He sighed helplessly at his mother's words, but didn't say anything. He had gotten used to Michelle's methods of persuasion a long time ago. He had respected his mother from a very young age, but whenever she brought up the marriage issue, he would always find an excuse or change the topic so as to avoid the conversation. Today, Bryce was particularly reluctant to discuss the subject. "I've been very busy lately, Mom. Perhaps some other weekend." Then Bryce suddenly had a thought. It didn't matter whom he married, just as long as he was married. That meant he could marry anyone he wanted. Natalie's image suddenly appeared in his mind. When Michelle saw her son wasn't a bit interested in talking about the matter, she thought about trying to persuade him, but Bryce's phone suddenly rang, interrupting them. Bryce saw the caller ID and frowned. Natalie's number. The moment he thought of her, she called him. What a coincidence. Bryce wasn't really sure that he wanted to answer Natalie's call, but almost without realizing it, he automatically pressed the answer button. "What's the matter?" Bryce's voice was cold, distant. Liam, on the other end of the line, was stunned for a moment. He hadn't expected Bryce to actually answer the phone. He froze. Bryce, unsure if the caller had hung up, looked at his phone. He was about to hang up when Liam's small, scared voice came out of the phone's speaker. "Dad, I'm so scared. That bad uncle just blocked the door and was bullying Mommy. I'm scared." Bryce's expression darkened, and an intense light filled his eyes. Immediately, he grabbed his jacket and left the villa. Michelle saw her son leave in a hurry. She was very confused and wondered what had happened. Why would Bryce be in such a rush to leave so suddenly without saying anything? Meanwhile, at Natalie's place, she was relaxing. Her hair was still wet. She was so tired she hadn't bothered to dry it. She watched Liam, who was drawing pictures and occasionally looking up to check the time. Natalie was about to tell Liam to go to bed and rest when the doorbell suddenly rang. The bell startled her. The things that Nick had said about the Davidsons before he left were still fresh in her mind. They'd really come this late. Liam's eyes lit up when he heard the doorbell, but Natalie didn't notice. She went to open the door. Bryce had an icy expression on his face when Natalie opened the
Pero
door.
pagka ano ni
She
Paing, ito
stared
na
at
lang
Bryce,
natitira
her
sa akin,
eyes
kailangan
wide,
na
not knowing
tubos
how to
din
react
kagad.
for a moment. He looked at Natalie. Her skin and hair were glowing after her shower. Her skin was like
Kahit
pure
mga
silver.
3,000 kaya.
Natalie blushed, noticing him staring at her. Confused, she closed the door. Bryce was still standing outside the door, but he wasn't angry. Instead, thinking about her being so startled, he felt a surge of sympathy and affection for Natalie. Natalie went to the bedroom to change her clothes.
Sasanla ko to.
Meanwhile, Liam opened the door and welcomed Bryce in. Bryce was able to size up the two
Nakalive
rooms
ako.
in front of him.
Hindi.
Although the house was small, it felt very cozy and welcoming. Natalie walked out of the bedroom.
Ulit pa
Seeing
nga.
Bryce sitting on the sofa, she couldn't help but ask
Sanla mo muna yung
awkwardly,
singsing ko.
"What are you doing here?" Bryce asked bluntly, "Where is that guy? The one who was here?" Natalie immediately realized he was
Wag.
asking about Nick.
Sakto lang.
She stuttered a reply. "He's gone already."
Pagbayad ni
Then
Paing.
asked, suddenly suspicious, "Hold on. How did you know he was here?" Bryce looked at her but did not respond. She immediately thought, "Must be Liam again. Everything is all right now. Did you really come all the way out here for that?" Bryce realized that Liam had
Ay,
tricked
nanto.
and shot away a sulky look.
Bumisit
It
ka.
would help if Liam asked, sure. She thought she might as well start looking for another job. Even though she had married Bryce, it was only a contract marriage, and his arrangement was only temporary. For many years, she had never relied on anyone to support her and Liam. She felt there was no reason to change her mindset. As Bryce walked past the living room, he saw Natalie engrossed in her laptop. He walked up behind her, looked at the laptop screen, and asked, "What are you doing?" Natalie, startled, turned around. She let out a long sigh. She said sadly, "I got a job offer a few days ago, but today I found out the company is restructuring. So I thought I should have looked for another job somewhere else." Natalie said in a mocking way, "The manager at that damned company was probably sent by fate to stop me from moving forward with my future. Looks like he doesn't want me, a good employee. Maybe this company really deserves to fail." She felt better after venting out loud. She didn't notice that Bryce's expression was a little pained. He felt torn. He knew he had to lay off staff who were incompetent and poisoning the company. Was Natalie implying that people like him were tyrants? If so, this would be the first time in his life he'd been scolded. This woman was pretty old. The warm evening light shone on Natalie's face, giving her a glow. Bryce looked at her, and his anger melted away. Without realizing the change in his heart, he sat down beside her. To comfort her, he said, "When a company has a problem, we can only blame the previous owner for their lack of experience or their stupidity. When a new owner takes over in these circumstances, they are the real victim. Often companies will have to cut jobs to recover. Cutting jobs can be the wisest decision." Natalie sighed. "I hear what you're saying, but you don't understand. I applied for a lot of jobs before this company finally accepted me. I never expected this to happen to me. It's just so disappointing." Then she remembered the incident that had happened at the company and got angry. The boss is to blame. He's been criticized and has a terrible image in the industry for fooling around with his own staff. Did he start this company just so he can fool around? Natalie quickly took her laptop and walked away towards her own room. In another part of the room, in the mansion of Howard Clare, everything was in disarray. Expensive porcelain and ornaments were scattered on the table, a complete mess. Bryce's cousin Howard was holding an antique vase that he really liked. Angrily, he smashed it to the floor. Porcelain splinters flew everywhere. The noise was audible in the rooms upstairs. Howard's father, Jimmy, came down to see what the fuss was about, and that's when he saw all the mess. Still on the stairs, he shouted sternly, "Howard, what's the matter? What the hell are you doing?" Seeing his father, Howard restrained his temper and stopped smashing things. But his eyes were still full of anger. He said bitterly, "It's all because of that idiot Bryce. Without my consent. What does he mean by that? I'm the president of that company, so now he wants to interfere with even my small company?" Jimmy let out a sigh. Of course he had heard about what was happening at the company, but even though he resented Bryce, he couldn't help but scold Howard. "It's your fault this happened. I've told you plenty times not to fool around. You've been caught red-handed by Bryce, so who can you blame? He was targeting our family initially, but now anyone who stands get hurt." Howard didn't like hearing his father's remark. Was he implying that Howard needed to take Bryce's advice into account before he did anything? "Dad, the Claire family is almost completely controlled by Bryce now. Do you think that we should be eclipsed by him like that? Don't you think it's terrible to hear all the rumors flying around? People say that we're mere worms in the Claire family." The more Howard said, the angrier he became. Jimmy shouted, "That's enough," and he shut up. Jimmy said, "Why do you think I'm saying this to you? If you were more serious and responsible in your work, maybe your grandfather would take you seriously. But you don't take anything seriously and you're lazy. Compared to Bryce, you're in a pretty weak position." All the anger went out of Howard and he grumbled, "Grandpa is just too biased. He gave everything to Bryce. I would be just as good as Bryce if I only had the same resources." Jimmy looked at him coldly. He knew his son better than anyone. Was he really that capable? But no matter what anyone said, or however much they complained, The fact remained that Jimmy's family was just the poor relatives of the Clare family. The family's power and influence were all under the main family member's control, which Jimmy's branch of the family hated. Jimmy's age and experience made him more cautious when doing things in the family compared to Howard. He consoled his son. Listen, Howard, I know about the family's current situation, but you can't act on impulse. Listen, do well in the company first. Then we can discuss things further. Once you've achieved good results, go to your grandfather and talk things through with him. Howard, realizing that this was his only realistic option, nodded his head reluctantly. Just as he was going to respond, his father continued. In the meantime, I think you'd better control yourself and stop fooling around. If you don't get there, you'll have Bryce dominating you for the rest of your life. Howard understood that this was going to be a very busy time. He couldn't afford to be careless, and he really had something to prove. He lowered his head and said reluctantly, "Okay, Dad, I understand." The next morning, Natalie was just about to wake Liam when the company called her on the phone. Natalie was pessimistic, expecting the news that she wouldn't be required to go to work there after all. But, to her surprise, the HR manager informed her that she could start on the following Monday. Hearing this good news about her job, Natalie yelled in excitement, "Yay!" Overjoyed, she gave Liam a big hug and a kiss. "Liam, I got the job after all. Now I can support you. I'm so happy." Feeling his mother's joy, Liam was also very happy. Although he was still a bit dizzy from Natalie's tight hug, he looked at her with his big eyes and said, "I knew you could do it. How could a company not want my mommy?" The pair of them danced around the room, shouting excitedly. This was the happiest Natalie had been since she returned from abroad. Meanwhile, Bryce was downstairs having coffee in the dining room. He frowned when he heard the commotion upstairs, but he was curious about what was going on up there to warrant such a noise. Mrs. Perkins also chuckled. Finally, there was life and laughter in the family home. She smiled and said to Bryce, "Sir, doesn't it feel great to have a family?" Bryce looked at the ceiling but didn't say anything. The feeling he had in his heart at that moment was a subtle one. Although he didn't resent the people upstairs, it was also the case that he found such noise in his home hard to get used to. After a while, Natalie and Liam calmed down. She got Liam ready and brought him downstairs. When she reached the corner of the stairs, she saw Bryce sitting in the dining room drinking his coffee. She was slightly surprised. An uneasy look flashed across her face. She thought to herself, "Don't tell me he heard what I said to Liam just then." Even though she hadn't said anything bad, she was still embarrassed to think of all her business being laid out in front of Bryce. While she was still mulling this over, Mrs. Perkins saw them both and called them over for breakfast. As soon as Liam sat down at the dining table, he quickly spilled out, "Dad, Mrs. Perkins, my mom has a job. She can go to work now." Natalie smiled happily. This was, after all, her first job since she came back. It was a big thing for her. Bryce glanced at her and said, "So, it seems like your boss was not as bad as you thought, huh?" Natalie smiled awkwardly as she recalled the way she'd criticized her boss, someone whom she'd never actually met. She said, "It sure seems that way, I guess. If I get a chance to meet him, I'll certainly be showing my gratitude." Bryce sipped his coffee. Sometimes Natalie seemed a bit too straightforward, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. After breakfast, Bryce raised his head to look at Liam and asked, "Liam, you should be starting school now, right?" Natalie had also been considering the same, especially now that she had found a job. She wanted to send him to kindergarten, but maybe the little guy was too smart for that. Would he be willing to go to kindergarten? So at Bryce's prompting, she asked him, "Liam, will you go to kindergarten?" He snorted. "I don't want to go to kindergarten. The kids in kindergarten are too childish. I don't want to be with them." Natalie had suspected Liam would say that, and she also knew that if he didn't attend kindergarten, his social and learning skills wouldn't really be affected. But she still tried to coax him. "Liam, don't be like that. You're a child too. One of life's experiences is going to kindergarten at your age. It's an important part of your childhood." It was rare for Liam to see his mother have such enthusiasm towards him, so he was very happy. He lowered his head, thinking. Finally, he raised his head, gave a slight smile, and said, "If it will make you happy, then I will go to kindergarten." Seeing his thoughtfulness and maturity, Natalie grinned. She gave a nod and said, "Deal." After a while, she asked, "So, which school should we enroll you at?" This question was really directed to Mrs. Perkins. Mrs. Perkins thought for a moment and said, "Of course, Liam will have to go to the best school. How about you let me take care of choosing, based on my local knowledge? What do you think?" Natalie was surprised by this. She wasn't worried whether Mrs. Perkins was capable of finding a good school. She was sure she was, actually. But at the same time, she didn't want to trouble her, given the complexity of enrolling a child into an educational establishment. She glanced at Bryce and saw that he was looking at her too. Before she could say anything, Bryce said, "Mrs. Perkins, I'll be happy for you to handle the school process for you." Natalie wasn't sure how to respond, so she just smiled gratefully at Mrs. Perkins and said, "Are you sure that wouldn't be too much for you to do? I don't want to bother you with Liam unnecessarily." Mrs. Perkins shook her head and said, "Natalie, please don't say that. I'm glad to look after Liam. I certainly don't think it's bothersome. I'm very happy to do it." She smiled happily. She had never been married, having worked for the Clare family from a very young age. To her, Bryce was like her own son. If she could now look after Bryce's own son too, how could she not be happy? Seeing Mrs. Perkins so happy eased Natalie's concerns. Bryce went to work after breakfast, and, leaving Mrs. Perkins looking after Liam, Natalie went to start preparing herself for her new job. Although she had not gone to the office properly yet, she wanted to prepare herself for what was to come. After all, she thought, a good plan is required for a battle. The first thing she planned to do was find out more about the employees at the company. She called the HR manager and briefly explained her thinking. The HR manager was quite cooperative. "Call me Daryl," he said. "Daryl Maitland." "Mr. Maitland, Daryl, please would you send me a list with the names of the other employees at the company?" Natalie requested politely. Maitland was a pretty easygoing person, and he had no hesitation replying, "No problem. I'll send you the names shortly. If you have any other questions, just feel free to ask me." Natalie hadn't been expecting things to go so smoothly, so her mood was pretty good. She thanked Maitland and hung up. Shortly afterward, she was favorably impressed by Maitland's efficiency. She opened the email and started reading through it. The more she read, the more disappointed she became. It seemed clear to her that the entertainment company was lacking talented and remarkable people, and had been lacking them for a long time. Natalie had plenty of experience in the entertainment industry from her work abroad, and during her time working in the industry, she had seen many talented men and women. People of that caliber seemed to be lacking here.
At least ito magaling.
Pwede nga kulit mo. Mas marunong ka pa sa akin niya eh.
Episode 43, Where is the Talent? Natalie was unpleasantly surprised by the information about the artists at Star Entertainment. The artists at this company, men and women alike, were all as handsome or beautiful as the artists at other entertainment companies. What was surprising was that they had no talent or qualifications. She had wanted to work with a female actress, but after looking at the information about all the company's actresses, she couldn't find any that were suitably qualified. It was almost as if these women had been hired for their decorative value rather than their acting skills. Natalie sighed resignedly. It looked as if the former boss of Star Entertainment had turned the company into his own personal playground. Natalie decided to look at the list of male actors instead. Maybe she'd have better luck there. But after going through the male actors' names, she still wasn't satisfied. Some of the actors here were a little famous, but they had not actually acted on stage. They were all D-list celebrities, the majority of whom had histories that they'd rather keep hidden. But even if their histories were wiped clean, the chances of them being successful were very slim, because they had no talent. After sorting through all the artist information again, she finally found someone she felt had a chance. The information showed a male artist called Tony Bobble. He had once acted in a very popular classic time-traveling drama, Love Through Time, in which he was the second main lead. He was still very young, just 22 years old. His features were so handsome and regular that she would barely. His perfection was almost doll-like. There was little doubt that viewers of all ages were likely to be bewitched by him. Natalie was very curious about Tony Bobble. Someone like him, although he did not have much talent, should still be able to become famous based purely on his looks. Instead, he was languishing here, an unknown person in this company. Something wasn't right. Natalie racked her brains trying to figure it out. Couldn't come up with a reason. Feeling that Tony could represent a new beginning for the company after the restructuring, she went online to search for the TV drama Love Through Time so she could assess Tony's acting skills. Natalie watched the drama carefully and was pleasantly surprised. Tony Bobble was a hidden jewel. Although his acting skills were a bit raw, he definitely had potential. Skills were polished and shaped properly, and with the correct guidance, he could definitely become very well known throughout the country. How was it that he could have been so neglected? What a waste! Was Tony Bobble's manager stupid? It seemed to her that Tony's manager was indeed just as stupid as the former boss of Star Entertainment. Natalie decided that she would guide and nurture this male artist. However, these kinds of arrangements were often organized by the company. She started to worry about how, as a new agent, she could get the company's approval to move Tony Bobble to her management, away from his existing agent. Natalie started to overthink the situation and got herself even more worried. But this was her best chance, so she had to think of a way to seize it. Meanwhile, at the Clear Creek building, Bryce was reading a document when his assistant came into his office to give him an update on the progress of Star Entertainment's restructuring. He took the report documents from his assistant and started going through them. The more he looked, his expression darkened. The number of employees at Star Entertainment had fallen immensely compared with the previous roster. In the past, he'd sent a reliable manager to manage the company. But now there were only a dozen or so artists under the company's umbrella, and yet the manager had still hired a new agent. Glancing at the list of artists, he pulled out Tony Bobble's details and handed them to his assistant, saying, "Give this guy Bobble to the new agent to manage." The assistant was slightly surprised when he heard this, saying, "The new agent? You mean Natalie Davidson, the woman who just came back to the country?" Bryce nodded but didn't comment. His expression remained unchanged as he continued, "As for the other artists, they don't seem to have much potential. If it's time to terminate their contracts, then do so. As for looking for new artists, try the film and television academies. These days, the artists are the most important asset we have." Although the assistant wondered why Bryce, as CEO, was concerned about this Bobble guy, he didn't dare question his decision. When leaving the office, the assistant couldn't help but take a glance at Tony Bobble's profile. He had a weird feeling. Since when did the CEO of the company take the initiative in such trivial matters? Bryce had no idea what his assistant was thinking. When Bryce had seen Bobble's information, he had acted on impulse, without even knowing why. Perhaps I was hoping badly, Bryce thought, chuckling. Then his eyes suddenly took on an icy glare. Just take it as helping her out. We're married after all, he thought. When Bryce returned home later after a busy day's work, he saw Mrs. Perkins with Liam. She walked respectfully over to Bryce and greeted him. "Welcome back, sir." Bryce nodded in acknowledgement. He glanced over at Liam expressionlessly. Mrs. Perkins looked at Bryce, trying to read his mood, and said, "I found a few potential schools for him. I wanted to ask you your opinion on them." Natalie, who was upstairs, heard the voices below and came down. Liam hadn't seen his mom the whole day, and when he saw her coming down the stairs, he jumped into her arms. Natalie was about to respond to Liam when Mrs. Perkins continued, "Mrs. Bryce, the schools I just mentioned to Mr. Bryce are all excellent. Of course, they each have their good and bad points. I wonder which of them you think would be the best for Liam." Natalie didn't know about any of the schools, and she had no idea which school would be most suitable. Looking at Bryce, she stuttered, "I feel they're all good. So what should we do?" "I suggest we send Liam to Woodling Academy. Bryce said decisively to Mrs. Perkins. Hearing Bryce choose a school without any hesitation, Natalie wanted to know his reasonings, so she asked, why? Woodling Academy is one of the top schools in the country in terms of basic teaching, but more importantly, the Clare family is a shareholder, Bryce said casually. He looked at her with amusement. Natalie was speechless. This reasoning was enough to quiet anyone. She had no objections to the school choice. Mrs. Perkins felt a cozy, warm feeling when she saw the couple's interaction. She thought, did Mr. Bryce smile just now? It had been such a long time since she'd seen him smile like that. Episode 44, An Unpolished Gem. The next morning, Mrs. Perkins completed Liam's enrollment forms. Natalie was impressed by her speed and efficiency. Natalie said, Mrs. Perkins, Liam and I have put you into a great deal of trouble. As his mother, I didn't contribute much to this whole process. I feel ashamed of myself. Oh, Mrs. Clare, what are you saying? You and Mr. Bryce are busy enough. I'm happy to take care of the little guy. In fact, I'm willing to do anything for him. Then Mrs. Perkins added, besides, this is what Mr. Bryce instructed me to do, so don't think too much about it. She had already come to her conclusions about Natalie's character. She figured that Natalie tended to think too much, and so Mrs. Perkins had wanted to reassure her. Natalie felt awkward. Just then, Bryce, who was about to leave, passed by. She said, Bryce, thank you. He replied casually before leaving. Natalie was dismayed. What kind of answer was that? So cold and impersonal. But today was the first day of school, so she realized that she'd better get going. She and Mrs. Perkins drove Liam over to the Woodling Academy. Seeing Liam outside the school gates in his smart tailored suit, a backpack swung over his shoulder, Natalie smiled with satisfaction. Liam felt embarrassed by his mother staring at him. He said, Mommy, why are you looking at me like that? She knelt down and said, Liam, you are a little genius. As long as you study hard, you will become an important man in the future. Do you understand what I'm saying? She did think that her son was a genius. If he wanted to learn something, there would be no obstacles to his progress. There was actually no need for her to work in the future. She could just depend on her son to support her. Liam frowned, not too pleased by all this fussing. He pretended to sigh as he glanced at the other kids getting out of their parents' cars. He said, If you're happy, I will do anything you say. He glanced at his mom helplessly. When Natalie saw his expression, her heart almost melted. She gave him a kiss on his cheek. Okay, Liam, hurry on in. Remember, you have to behave yourself at school, or else I'll make you go to kindergarten, Natalie warned. When Liam heard this, his face darkened, but then went back to normal and he said, I know, you're worried, but it's really no big deal. Natalie watched him enter the school, feeling a sudden emptiness inside her. Her little Liam was really growing up so quickly. Something was nagging at her, she realized. It took her a moment to register that it was Liam's darkened expression that was bugging her. That expression. That attitude. It was as if he was carved out of the same material as Bryce. Natalie actually found this quite funny. Maybe it was because they had been living together and Bryce's expressions and attitudes were starting to rub off on Liam. Surely Bryce couldn't be related to the boy's biological father. It's logical, Natalie thought, for the immediate environment to affect a child's behavior. This thought comforted her. It was Monday, and it was also the first day of Natalie's job at Star Entertainment. The research she'd done at home meant there was no need for her to waste any more time getting familiar with the job after arriving at the office. In the afternoon, she went to the office. She wanted to discuss the matter of Tony Bobble with the department head. Now that the company had been restructured, the offices looked strangely deserted. She asked for directions to the department head's office. She had heard that the department leader had been sent over here by the new boss after the restructuring. He was apparently a rather old-fashioned person, but one who took his work extremely seriously. When Natalie saw him, she was astonished. If she remembered correctly, the name of this guy was Gary Willis. He used to be a mogul at Clare Entertainment. He had mentored many rookie agents who later became outstanding agents. And on top of that, his films had won many awards. How on earth had the boss managed to recruit such an outstanding person into a small company like Star? And more importantly, why would he accept such a position? Natalie secretly admired her new boss's abilities. This gave her more confidence in the company. Willis welcomed Natalie into his office, and they greeted each other before she got straight to the point of her visit. She said, "I want to be Tony Bobble's manager. He's a rare talent, and I've seen his performances. As long as he's guided properly, I think he'll definitely become a big star." Natalie looked at Willis cautiously. She wondered if he would agree to her managing Tony Bobble. After all, she had only just started here. She did not expect Willis to agree so readily, but he said, "Natalie, to be honest, this guy Bobble has already been lined up for you to guide. I've read your resume, and it's outstanding. Not only that, you will have a special privilege. Your role in the company is just to manage and protect Tony Bobble. That's all. If you have any problems, you can go to your superior to resolve them." Natalie was completely surprised. This would probably be really convenient for her. "Thank you," she said gratefully, and then made her way to the practice room to find Tony Bobble. However, there had been a look of pity in Willis's eyes when he mentioned Tony Bobble, but Natalie hadn't noticed. She asked for directions to the practice room and went there immediately. The artists at Star Entertainment would usually rehearse in the practice room when they had nothing specific to do, so Tony being there was pretty likely. Meanwhile, in a director's office elsewhere, a man was leaning against a leather sofa, sipping his coffee. The steam from the coffee machine softened the appearance of his skin, making him appear quite pale. He looked to be in his early 30s, well-mannered and dressed in an expensive suit. He had a stern expression. While sipping his coffee, he wore a smile that made him look very satisfied. This man was Tony Bobble's manager, Mark Ellington. There was another, younger man in the room. He was even more handsome. Every single facial feature was like a work of art, perfect and without blemishes. His fair skin made him appear slightly delicate, but he had a strong build. He stood there like a puppet with no expression on his face. This was Tony Bobble. Ellington put his coffee cup into its saucer and said, "Tony, have you considered what I said to you last night? Are you really that sad to see me today?" Ellington's eyes were bright and eager as he looked at Tony. Episode 45, Shameless. When Tony heard Ellington's question, he felt his mask of expressionlessness start to crack. He looked like he was trying very hard to suppress the disgust he felt, and he was trembling. Tony said nothing. Failing to suppress his anger, he looked at Ellington with hostility. Ellington said, "You're even more good-looking when you're angry, you know that?" Then Ellington changed his tone and continued. "As long as you agree to the conditions I offered you yesterday, I can definitely make you famous. Then you'll have enough money to help that seriously sick sister of yours. It's a win-win situation. Why not accept my proposal?" Ellington recalled how Tony had refused to cooperate with him yesterday, saying he'd rather die than do what Ellington wanted. He felt the incident was pretty ridiculous, but infuriating at the same time. Tony was quite strong-willed, but as his agent, Ellington could make Tony's life difficult by hiding him away from prospective employers. At the mention of his sister's illness, Tony's face turned pale, and his body trembled even more. Ellington saw that his words were having an effect, and he felt determined to get what he wanted. Ellington knew that the company was going through a restructuring, giving him the opportunity to pressurize Tony. Tony bit his bottom lip. He felt lost, with nowhere to run. He hated Ellington for insulting him time after time. Just at that moment, someone knocked on the door and walked straight in. Ellington's assistant. Seeing Ellington's expression, the assistant hesitated. Ellington's good mood was ruined. He snapped at the assistant. "What is it? Spit it out, why don't you?" The assistant lowered his head and said, "Mr. Ellington, it's not good news. I've been told that the company has assigned Mr. Bobble to another agent. From today, the other agent will be looking after him." Tony's eyes filled with the light of hope at this. Maybe there was finally a chance to turn things around. But Ellington cut across these thoughts, yelling, "Ridiculous! Howard and I are good friends. No one would dare snatch my people away. This new agent has no idea who they're dealing with here. There's no need to worry about them." He snorted, not giving the new agent another thought. The assistant felt embarrassed. He gave Tony a worried look and left the office. With just the two of them in the office again, Ellington sat thinking before laughing out loud. So, my big star, Tony. I've been waiting on you for a long time now. Have you still not made up your mind? But I guess it's okay. I have plenty of time. I can wait for you. But can your sister's illness wait? I don't think she can last more than a year based on what I understand. Time ticks on. Seeing the despair on Tony's face, he kept pressing. The artist's golden period doesn't last very long. How many good years do you think you have left? If you agree to do what I want, I'll give you everything. Fame, money, everything. Think about it, huh? These words ignited Tony's anger, and rage filled him. He roared, "But I'm not interested in you, or in what you want." Ellington chuckled. I know, Tony, I know. But you know how this industry works, and you're already in it. Being naive will just cause you more suffering. He had kept Tony effectively hidden away from potential employers for 2 years, and he could easily keep him hidden for another 2. Tony was still shaking with anger. If Ellington hadn't hindered his career, he could have been a star by now. Ellington refused to let go of his opportunity and kept probing at Tony's weakness. He said, "Okay, let's consider that in this day and age, everyone needs a financial backer. How can you become popular otherwise? Some artists find a way to get people to back them, often by giving those people what they want. What makes you less successful than those people is that you're too stubborn. You don't give the important people what they want. However, Ellington went on, if you start to appreciate your situation, then it's still not too late. Think about it. You're still young and you want to be popular. And the only thing you need is a word from me to make you famous. How about that?" He kept on Tony in this vein. Finally, Tony snapped, punching a glass bottle on the counter next to him and grazing his knuckles. He yelled, "Will you stop this blackmail? I want to change agents." What the assistant had said was Tony's last hope, and he was desperate to take the opportunity. It didn't matter if the new agent was a nobody. He just wanted to cut ties with Ellington. Ellington glanced at Tony unperturbed and said silkily, "Look, Howard and I are good friends. In this company, he has the ultimate authority. Why don't you ask him to change your agent and see if he approves a swap?" Tony stood there in despair, feeling trapped. It was as if his life was over, with no way out. Ellington, seeing Tony's despair, said quietly, "Follow me. Well, you won't be treated unfairly, I promise. In the entertainment industry, it's not just you who gets to decide your fate. You need others to help you." Ellington touched Tony on the shoulder. Just at that moment, the door banged open loudly. Natalie stood in the doorway, glaring. She'd been listening to the men's